2008 of the Ordinance Committee to order. Project compatibility analysis. We have a presentation from staff. Ms. Weiss.
Thank you. I'd like to turn it over to Jaime Limon for the Planning Division presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members.
First of all, just in case we have, does anybody have public comment on an item not on the agenda first? No? Thanks.
Good afternoon. Before I begin the presentation, I wanted to give an overview of the issues that staff is going to outline with respect to this discussion. Planning staff has been working with our boards and commissioners since last year to try to develop some additional tools and analysis to deal with the issue of larger buildings in the city and how we communicate between the boards and commissions, specifically on the issue of height, mass, bulk, and scale, and compatibility with design guidelines. So in doing this, I'm going to go through some of the current project review process, have you understand how the process is supposed to work, and give you some examples of actual project comments that were given over the series of years, specifically on the Chapala Street Corridor projects, to give you an idea of maybe some of the problems associated with those comments and whether or not the true sentiments of the boards and commissions or the Historic Landmarks Commissions was given to the Planning Commission in order to make those land use decisions. We also want to review the series of discussions we had, culminated by a workshop meeting that we had with jointly with the City Council and our boards and commissions back in July of last year, where we sort of had group discussions and went through the issues of what could we do to improve our process and our discussions with respect to these larger buildings in the community. We're also going to go over the review of how these development of these findings were created and the type of discussions we had with the ABR and HLC with respect to those findings. And then have you walk you through some of the explanation on the staff concerns on the use of findings. I think there has been a reconsideration of whether or not findings is the correct tool to go forward with, and you'll understand some of the concerns that we have on whether or not findings would be the appropriate tool. And then discuss in the proposal as we have presented it, and which we do not have a draft ordinance at this time. So we will ask this ordinance committee to give us some answers to some remaining questions and see if we're on the right track. And if we are, maybe we could proceed and forward this to the City Council if you're so apt to do so today, or give us appropriate direction to craft the ordinance at this time. And with that, I'd like to just get into the issue of what the current conditions are out there. We have received feedback from the community regarding size and height of new large buildings. We're aware of that. It's very public that there's some concern about these larger buildings. And the question is, are existing policies, guidelines, and tools available for boards and commissions? And if not, could new methods or tools be implemented to improve how large projects are evaluated by boards and commissions? And how can we improve the communications from the ABR and the HLC to the Planning Commission and staff hearing officer? We're here trying to deal with this issue. We think we have a good discussion today on whether or not changes can be made to improve the process. This is not about trying to make our boards and commissioners less apt to comment on projects. This is actually trying to add some structure so our boards and commissions can give adequate direction to the land use decision makers at Planning Commission, and then conversely that those decisions are based on actual comments geared towards the elements of those designs that either are problematic or whether or not the boards and commissions can support the project on those bases. So in understanding our review process, I think it's critical to understand that the concept review is the opportunity for our ABR or Historic Landmarks Commission's comments to be put on record. What do they feel about this structure, this design concept with respect to site design, with respect to setbacks, size, bulk, and scale? To some degree, it's the first shot that the developer has to get a true sentiment on whether a project can be supported or not. And those comments are very critical in order to guide the developer towards a project that could be potentially supported not only by the commission but by staff, leading towards a presentation to our decision makers, which are either the staff hearing officer or the Planning Commission, with respect to whether this building is consistent with all our ordinances and guidelines and policies. The decision point at the staff hearing officer or planning commission is the major land use decision. And consequently, when we expect a project to return back for preliminary approval at the ABR Historic Landmarks Commission, what we're saying is that the art boards and commissions need to look at the project as it has returned from the planning commission and understand whether it's in substantial conformance with their original direction and comments to the project. And where we have a breakdown in the process is if the comments that were given to the staff hearing officer of the planning commission weren't clear enough or weren't presented accurately, or if the project returns back in a revised design somewhat different with specific directives to change the design. And sometimes our boards and commissions are hampered by those types of directions with respect to lowering height or changing a project in a way, in a manner where they feel like they have to make it look pretty again. So our process is such that we want clarity in the process, and so we don't have an applicant coming back to preliminary approval and faced with a major redesign of their project. And of course, they lead to a final approval of the project. Now, what I did was, what is the problem? What has been historically the problem? Well, we went through and looked at the types of comments that were given from the Historic Landmarks Commission and the Planning Commission, and to some degree, some of the comments that they worked through were specific to this, supporting the project or giving comments that they had general support for the project. In this case, you can see some comments that were directed towards making some roof changes and making some studying of certain elements of the project. But in general, they did make a statement that the size and the bulk and scale of the project was supported. So this is what historically has happened. And what we're suggesting is that we need more structure to these comments. And that structure would assist not only the boards and commissions to get real good statements on all these design elements, but also give the applicant clear direction on whether they have a project that in fact is supported, and whether or not the Planning Commission in fact will get clear direction on whether that level of support is either positive or negative. Here's another example of 401 Chapala Street, Chapala 1 project where there was actual statements that the setbacks are acceptable. The building scale can be addressed as the project progresses. There was concern on that project with respect to the height of the building, but there was also a major creek back setback issue to the rear. And I think the Planning Commission struggled with the fact of trying to put that building away from that creek and admitting that the building was getting taller as a result of that concession. But there are struggles working through the design of a project when you have constraints on a site. But again, could this have been more clear as far as height of the structure? Was there a statement specific to height on it? I know the Commission worked to change the design to make it better. And I think this project had 4 concept reviews, so there was this give and take there. Here's one at Paseo Chapala. Again, generally supports the mass, bulk, and scale. That was the whole issue of whether the building should be at the street level. Is it consistent with our urban design guidelines? We have some flexibility to some degree in the urban design guidelines to ask for some additional landscaping and or setbacks, but again, there's some conflicting guidelines in our urban design guidelines which ask that we have a street presence. And sometimes when you have a building right up to the front property line, we have this immediate effect of a size, bulk, and scale in this case. And here's again 517 Chapala Street, which okay, this is actually one subject to appeal. But I just wanted to mention that we had this project where we do have an issue of exactly what did the Planning Commission do and change, and this eventually came back at a different design, and having our Historic Landmarks Commission struggle with that design, and it's subject to an appeal next month. So leading towards the background, we did have this joint workshop Council Planning Commission meeting where we heard a staff presentation that outlined all our existing policies and implementation strategies and guidelines and elements that laid out what we were trying to encourage was approving the large projects which included mixed-use and used condominium projects that have this housing element tied to these transit corridors. And we did have additional standards or findings. We evaluated whether these additional findings or standards should be required as a result of these larger buildings that were being approved. We also had defined whether or not these issues were larger issues, issues that should be brought up in the context of our Plan Santa Barbara general plan update. So these group discussions did, in fact, reveal that there were concerns regarding community design and small-town character, and there were larger development patterns and higher density being proposed in our downtown. We have larger condominium units, more upper-story units, and taller buildings as a result. And then when they were combined with reduced setbacks and possible modifications to reduce open space, and in fact, we were having buildings that are a little bit larger than in years past. So what do we do? We had group discussions. There were some discussions with respect to, well, long-term, these are all a very complex set of concerns and community values that we need to examine as part of the general plan update with respect to the variable density zoning requirements to encourage smaller units on projects, increasing front yard setbacks for taller buildings that would involve zoning changes or downzoning, and new height standards for outflow vehicle, whether those would be appropriate. Again, thinking that that's part of the general plan update discussions. But we did realize that there possibly could be some short-term change, and that's when we got into the issue of checking compatibility with surrounding development. We have good urban design guidelines that speak to compatible development, and the question is whether or not we could improve on the way we implement the enforcement of those guidelines, and or whether staff can assist in that process with the use of checklists or incorporating structure like today's discussion on findings or criteria. So draft findings were prepared by staff based on the outcome of that discussion, where we thought we should ask critical questions on these areas. In general, these had to do with the size, bulk, and scale compatibility issue, the architectural character compatibility, compatibility with adjacent historic landmarks, which was brought up as an issue, sufficient open space and landscaping, and then general consisting with design guidelines. So, we thought that these are the categories that were important to be addressed with respect to findings. And we had 2 meetings at the ABR where they reviewed these draft findings, and 1 at the Historic Landmarks Commission. And for the most part, they were in general support of the fact that we did want to have some type of additional structure to their comments. They supported the fact that in years past they may not have touched on all these elements, and it would be important in the future to incorporate this. But we did ask them specifically, well, where should these findings apply to? And one of the clear directions that we got from originally ABR was they felt that it really should apply to the projects that were going to the Planning Commission and the show, that those were the larger projects that really the community was struggling with, and that should possibly be the trigger. There was also some discussion with respect to, well, should the findings always be required for any project that the boards review? And the reality is that the board has a wide variety of projects that they review. It could be as simple as a door change all the way up to a very large building. And it didn't make sense to apply these findings to all projects. There was definitely comments with respect to protecting adjacent historic resources, just not landmarks, but any historic resource abutting or adjacent to the proposed development. So we made some changes with respect to that finding. There was some discussion about defining what sufficient meant with respect to landscaping. What would be sufficient? How can we quantify that in better terms? But in reality, I think what we did do is it is up to the discretion of the board to determine what sufficient is. And what we did was eventually change that to appropriate landscaping. And that could also be defined or argued as far as what's appropriate landscaping. There was also a request to have general compliance with all design guidelines. We originally thought that urban design guidelines was the key document that needed to be enforced, when in reality it is also dealing with their own guidelines which speak to architectural compatibility. And so we thought that by expanding that finding to all design guidelines, there could be a more definitive statement made. And then there was concern about duplicity of findings. Are all of them necessary? And that's one of the questions we have today. Did we break down these findings or criteria consideration to deal with all the elements that should be discussed with respect to comments given to our Planning Commission or board, or even with their own project approvals? And we did have a request to renumber and reorganize findings. That's something that we cleaned up. So the draft findings at the Historic Landmarks Commission and ABR look slightly different than what's being proposed, and I'll outline those changes right now. And then again, when the findings are made, some discussion about when and how those findings. And we just realized that we needed to talk about process, because they're directly related to what the process is and whether or not findings would be a good element to include. So these are the actual edited version of the findings that were tweaked with review by the ABR and the Landmarks Commission. And so there was minor tweaks and changes. There were a series of 5 findings that were, again, forwarded on to discussions with our city attorney. And then when we had that good discussion about, well, how are we going to implement these findings, we actually had concerns about how these findings will be implemented. The idea of whether or not that would be actually a negative impact to the process. What would happen if we had a disagreement between our boards and commissions, where one board could make the findings and one couldn't? What about the idea of finding technically not being totally 100% consistent with that conclusion? In other words, general compatibility with a finding on consistency with a design guideline, for example. If one could argue that, well, you made a finding that the project is consistent with design guidelines, yet they violated some guideline or chose not to enforce that guideline, because that's what guidelines do. You have an ability to be flexible with design guidelines. And then there's also the possibility that there would be this conflict in their roles in the review process, and I'll explain that later on in how that would work. And then we thought that it would unnecessarily complicate our city review process if we introduced new triggers in order to make findings. When are these findings required? It would have to be explained in other details on whether or not the findings were applicable or not on this particular type of project. So what we agreed upon is that we would adjust our proposal now to have this criteria on or consideration of review subjects as the tool for when the ABR, the Historic Landmarks, would consider when they were to either grant preliminary approval or to provide planning commission or comments to the planning commission. And it's laid out in a way that it specifically headlines the area of the specific criteria that's to be expanded on with comments. And we also included public views of the ocean and mountains. We felt that that was something that was missing that has come up specifically in the outer State Street with respect to view of mountains and other portions of the city where people are concerned about view corridors, that is an element that maybe they could, the boards and commissions could speak to. And this is this actual specific language. I'll put this up again if you want to go through the actual questions that are to be asked by our boards and commissions with respect to developing comments to the review boards and when they approve a project. These are the sort of the structure that we're proposing to our review process. And as you can see, they're pretty specific with respect to questions. Today we have some, we're seeking direction on whether these are the type of questions that we should be asking or whether this is the form that you would support. Now, what would the proposed project review process entail? What we're doing here now is just focusing on developing comments on compatibility review subjects. That's the new component that we would introduce, that these questions are answered and we get really good comments at concept review. And those comments are considered seriously by our planning commission and our staff hearing officer with respect to these issues. So when a project comes back for preliminary approval, the fact is that the planning commission did make a decision on the land use approval with this consideration criteria developed. And what we're suggesting is if when a project returns back, in order to add consistency with the process, we not have a project subject to a possible reversal of the land use decision. By incorporating this type of certainty to the process, we understand that the issues were considered and decided upon. Now, that's not to say that the boards and commissions can't revise a project to some degree, but what we don't want are major changes to the project occurring that would not give some certainty to the applicant. In other words, should a project return back and then have major discussions on setbacks and height of the building be still entertained at that point? So these are the discussion issues and questions that we've outlined today. What types of projects require these considerations? Should some projects be exempt from this type of considerations? Should the consideration, review, subjects, and criteria be expanded and reduced? Those are those 6 areas. And is the questions format appropriate, or are there other suggestions from the ordinance committee? And obviously, whether or not the findings, do you agree with staff's consideration of those issues, whether findings are appropriate or whether these questions and considerations is the appropriate tool to proceed? And with that, again, we'd like to have some direction to staff on this issue and give us some inclination as to whether we're prepared to draft an ordinance today. That concludes my presentation.
Questions from ordinance committee members? Mr. Francisco.
Jaime, when this was last before the ABR, there was some concern from the ABR about the actual text of these questions. There was no awareness whatsoever at that time on their part of this extra little codicil to the process that's been added, that after it's gone to SHO or the Planning Commission and been approved, that they can't deny it. You know, that was not part of what was presented to the ABR. And so my question is really, shouldn't this be being considered by the ABR, since they're going to have to be implementing this? It seems like it's changed pretty significantly from what was presented to them in November.
I think our city planner has some response to that, but I would clearly indicate that we always indicated to them that we were considering a proposal, and that proposal took the form of findings. But we also said that they needed structure to their comments. One of the board members said, why do we need this? We already do this, for example. And so I think that it is slightly different, but the same questions would be asked, whether they were findings or whether they're question form.
And I should say that, you know, the overall idea here I think is a great one. And I think staff did a good job of summarizing the comments that came from the original meeting back in July. And moving this forward. And I think it's a great idea to have this kind of checklist and make it more clear right from the beginning what the ABR's concerns are, for instance, or the HLC's. All of that is wonderful. All I'm questioning here is whether, given, I think, a pretty significant process change, whether that shouldn't go to ABR first for comments and see how they feel about that step.
Chair Williams, if I might respond as well. The ABR discussion was somewhat varied, as Jaime just mentioned. Some members questioned the need for it at all. There wasn't really that clear on which projects this would apply to. And so I think it was a good discussion that occurred at the ABR. But to be certain that we knew exactly how it was going to move to the Ordinance Committee, you know, it was subject to further discussion. I think that some ABR members realized that, again, there was an interest in trying to move this along to the council and get your direction. But I do want to clarify, this is not a change in the process with respect to the ABR or the HLC's ability to deny a project. That was part of committee member Dale Francisco's comment, which I think is very important to clarify. And the project, as it goes through the city's review process, is subject to a number of reviews and approvals. And the ABR or HLC at the preliminary approval stage, the final review stage, or a review after final stage, those are all action stages. And the ABR and HLC can deny a project preliminary approval, and they can deny a project final approval. It's the basis upon which they're making that decision that we're trying to clarify here. There's an overlap in the things that are considered as part of our land use entitlement process that overlap into design review, such as a major mixed-use project that's a development plan in a condominium. The Planning Commission or staff hearing officer finds that the project's consistent with the general plan, that it's compatible with the area, that it is appropriate in terms of size, bulk, scale, setback, landscape. So once the Planning Commission makes that decision on the project, the project itself and its form, its density, that's all set. Now, that doesn't mean that compatibility, landscape, setbacks aren't part of the design review. They are also very critical components of the design review. So what we're trying to make clear here is that at the concept review stage, the design review section can speak to all of those issues, both from a design standpoint and an overall project supportability. But once the Planning Commission approves the project and makes these findings, they set the basic parameters of the project, and when it returns to the design review boards, they are just implementing the project with refinement of design, not changing what the Planning Commission already found. And so it's a really important point that I can tell you one of the things that we've worked on consistently in the 20-plus years I've been doing this is the relationship between the design review boards and the decision-making that happens at the Planning Commission. And so that was where this problem came up for us. We thought if the design review board has to make findings after, then that could be a conflict. But they could still deny a project. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand that. It's the basis for denying it is that you're not moving forward consistent with what the Planning Commission set and our design guidelines as they should be applied to the approved project. For example, the materials are poorly designed. The color is wrong. The roof pitch, even though, if the Planning Commission said lower the heights, they need to make sure that the heights come down. Is the landscaping planter, what kind of landscaping goes in, the placement of the windows. There's a lot of design details, extremely important design details that would happen in the preliminary and final stages. But it needs to be a progression forward versus a cycle back. I think that's what we're trying to explain. And that was a major concern that the city attorney had as well.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just want to follow up on this because I really I think we should spend some time on this distinction. It's fundamental here, and it's just understanding what we need to do and how this will impact it is important, and even the semantics. Personally, I see the design review boards, ABR, HLC, as design review boards. And so I think it's misleading and confusing to us to say they can deny a project. They can certainly deny a project's design and say, no, that design is not at all what we talked about, directed you during concept. That design is not at all consistent with EPV guidelines or whatever it is. That design is the size, bulk, and scale is too much for me, and you go back and redesign. But they can't. I think an example that might illustrate this, because it's new and it's straightforward, if the SFDB, the Single Family Design Board, said to a homeowner, your design's denied, no, they wouldn't say that. They would say, no, that design doesn't work for us. It's too big. It's Mediterranean Spanish, and the neighborhood isn't whatever. But they wouldn't say you're denied. That's not what design review boards are supposed to do. But having said that, to take a project and to tell let's say a downtown project, the size, bulk, and scale is too much. The setbacks aren't great enough. The landscaping isn't good enough. The design is bad. Go back to the starting boards and start over is about as close to a denial as you're going to get. So I really, in a way, this is an important distinction, but I think the point is that the Planning Commission is the land use approval body. And so what we're trying to suggest here is a process whereby the design review boards weigh in early on these concerns. And their comments, their concerns go to the Planning Commission. I think that's the easiest example to talk about. They go to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission understands where HLC or ABR is coming from, and then the land use review occurs. Then it's determined whether the mixed-use project is appropriate, whether there's enough parking, whether the other land use environmental constraints, if you will, are appropriate. And at that point, the Planning Commission makes the findings in light of, makes the real project findings in light of the comments from the design review boards. And then, if I understand correctly what's being suggested, then they would go to preliminary design review in front of ABR or HLC. And at that point, so long as they have been consistent with their original project that received positive comments and that received Planning Commission approval, we would all be on the same page. But I think finally the main concern here is this idea that somehow there's two different avenues of land use approvals out there. And that just can't work. That'll be unworkable. The Planning Commission and ultimately, and you know, as I say all of this, all of it ultimately can get to the City Council. And that's why, that's a very important point. You know, we rely tremendously on the appeal process in this city. And by that I mean, and according to some, it's broken down for us lately. But when mistakes get made, they generally get appealed, and they get into this room, and they get a very prominent, high-level discussion. And as far as I'm concerned, when the elected officials decide it, that's the right decision because they're the elected officials. And that's, you know, having that larger context is important. We focus on the design review and planning commission, but with the appeal process, that's an important point.
Well, I think that's all important, and except for the divine infallibility of elected officials, we don't want to stay away from that.
For 4 years at a time only.
That's right. Well, it doesn't mean we can't make mistakes along the way, but the point being taken that both council and planning commission can, because they are the approving bodies, can constrain a project for further review by their very nature. Other questions from ordinance committee members? Mr. House, no? I have a couple small questions. What's the difference if we got rid of the verbiage of sufficient open space because that was too vague? What's less vague about appropriate?
I guess in response to that, Councilmember Williams, is that the sufficient was always a concern about quantity and quantity of landscaping versus whether it's appropriate or not, consistency with their design guidelines and appropriateness of it. And I think there was some discussion with our city attorney's office to say, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And ultimately, it's whether or not our design review board thinks the plan itself is appropriate based on consistency with design guidelines, not whether or not there's not a lack of landscaping. So I think that's why there was a tweak made on that specific element.
Then the second question I had is the enforceability of subjects versus findings. Compatibility review subjects, those aren't really things that people can litigate over, whereas a finding, if a public body violates a finding, it can be litigated, can it not? I guess my question is, if our goal was to make this tools stronger for approval bodies to say no to projects that are either too big or don't meet enough public good along with their size, then isn't drifting away from findings possibly not fulfilling that goal?
Mr. Chair, I don't think so. As a practical matter, any litigation in this context is going to be subject to what's called the substantial evidence test. And essentially that tells a Superior Court judge, who would be the judge deciding something like this, you don't make a personal decision. This is not your view of what's appropriate. You have to uphold the decision of the City Council, whether that's a denial or an approval, if there is some substantial evidence in the record to support their determination. And some substantial evidence just means some reasonable evidence. Even if the judge would be convinced otherwise by the contrary evidence, the judge is required to uphold the council's determination. The other thing that's involved here is that, and I have to say that I don't think the wording of these things matters a whole lot. It's all there really are bullet points to direct, say, the ABR or the Planning Commission to look at certain things. Look at public views. Look at landscaping. Look at size, bulk, and scale. And it's a very quantitative, subjective determination. The point about litigation is they will need to articulate their view. They will need to put on the record their substantial evidence. But having done that in a very subjective, qualitative way, rather, a judge isn't really going to second guess that, in my opinion, and whether it's findings or otherwise.
Mr. House?
This is for our staff. When I look at these, it seems to me like this is what ABR and HLC and the staff hearing officer are doing anyway, but structured in a way to prompt the questions. I mean, usually the chair's prompting these questions anyway, but this is the kind of territory we would expect ABR and HLC to cover on a particular project's way to a planning commission review of a development proposal. I mean, I don't see anything, all that, the view piece there, I know that, of course, that's always been seen in an environmental context with scenic public vistas. But besides that, is there anything else there that's really new? I mean, that's the kind of stuff we talk about any given Monday or whenever.
Councilman House, we believe we've identified the big picture, big question issues. Now, you're going to hear from our commissioners and see if they think we're on target as to whether or not there's some other considerations that they take into account. But we believe we've worked with our commissions and feel that these are the big questions that should be asked and should be documented as far as
well, my understanding from the minutes were that, and perhaps those who are here can speak to this, but and help clarify this, that it was their understanding that this would be, or their guidance, that these would be things that they wanted to make sure that the Planning Commission, staff hearing officer took into consideration, but they felt that they were doing it anyway. And that's what I would really like to hear people speak to when they come and talk to us. Because we also are asking them to, and have institutionally asked them to put on the subjective lens of members of our community to represent the community at large in things that may not be so objectifiable, checklistable. The context of the situation, they talk about size, bulk, and scale. There's no way to truly objectify that in terms of actual numbers, but they're working within their sensibilities and their architectural sensibilities, historic sensitivity, and that kind of thing. So, just a question here. Then, I had thought that I had expected when we were going to be talking about the idea of findings with regards to the problem that you outlined at the beginning, that the findings we might be talking about here would be the kinds of findings that would support an approval of a project that may seem larger than might be appropriate for a given area, but it would have some overriding community benefit or be historically so extraordinary, like say if we're not going to build another courthouse, but the courthouse is huge, so you'd have to say, that's so historically phenomenal that we would want to, but that's the kind of thing. The idea is that there would be findings that would justify a larger structure or one that might be difficult for the community at large to accept, and then the Planning Commission would have that to support a decision like that, or to actually go, or to say no, this does not provide the kind of community benefit that would justify this size of a structure, this bulky of whatever it is, these setbacks in this particular place. So you must have discussed that, I'm sure, on its way to coming here to us.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. I think the nature of that type of finding really is not appropriate at the design review part of the process. What I think we were talking about, and we have a planning commissioner here too, Commissioner Larson, is that the overriding reasons to, on balance, consider all of the objectives of the general plan and what's important for community values and weighing a project overall and approving the project. That's the kind of decision that the Planning Commission does based on a finding and consistency of the general plan. And I think we definitely have heard from planning commissioners when they've been grappling with some of the larger projects lately that where they need new guidance or reaffirming guidance is from the policy standpoint. The basic finding of finding it consistent with the general plan or not, that covers just about everything that you're talking about. And there could be additional findings looked at as part of the land use decision-making process as well. But the weight of what you're saying, of weighing those things, and should this community project move forward, having that kind of decision-making in the design review process, I think, would be problematic.
So your focus is on the design review
review process
and better communicating to the staff hearing officer, or excuse me, to the planning commission, I guess, and city council on appeal.
Yes.
Their rationale for supporting the projects moving forward like that.
Yes, and I really think we should hear from the commissioners that are here because, you know, they're at the desk, they're in the trenches doing this. And again, our intent is to, as you say, structure a lot of what we already do, just make it more clear when you look at those example of minutes.
Right.
Sometimes it's hard to tell if the area that they had a problem with, how important is that when the comment was they supported the size, bulk, and scale. And it's very hard when you're receiving these comments
I know.
So that's our goal.
Okay.
And I think the folks that are in the
literally
audience.
to improve the communication between the design review bodies and those who will be making a final or an
because we
decision.
think that strengthens the process overall. That was the objective. Strengthen the process, improve the process, and on a much bigger level of some of the community benefit things you're talking about, we really do think need to be addressed from a policy standpoint. And they have been already. I mean, look at the general plan now. There's an awful lot of important community values already expressed in the general plan that we're grappling with now. So, yeah, thank you.
I guess how I would see a goal out of this process, and what I saw the goal walking into the process was that we have a community concern about how much large buildings are being built. To me, the goal would be that we give our decision-making bodies the tools to ensure that less large buildings are approved, and those that are approved meet a higher threshold of public good. And so I guess I would like people to be as specific as possible in their comments as to what we should be, where we should be taking this, because I think there's a couple additional requirements that I could think of to put in front of the Planning Commission when we look at these projects. To me, it's not just what happens at HLC and ABR that's relevant, because, you know, I guess as far as I'm concerned, projects should meet those greater levels of public good, and right now it seems to me that we've had those be too vague for decision-making bodies being comfortable saying no, right? So being as specific as possible, I think, improves that process. So with that, we do have members of advisory bodies here, and if they want to go first, they can. If we want to be more Jacobin about this and just go in order of the people who did this, that's fine too. Do any of our HLC or ABR or Planning Commission members have to leave early, in which case we'll have you up right now? No? Okay. So you're okay with us going in order? Okay. Then we'll start with Judy Reyes from Allied Neighborhood Association.
Thank you very much. I'm Judy Arias. I'm president of the Allied Neighborhood Associations. I have a couple of concerns first that I raised when I was attending the ABR meeting. One of them was the question of, since mixed-use projects seem to be driving the commercial in the downtown area, that there'd be adequate park recreation, open space necessary, because you have families in these projects, and you as a city cannot tell people not to have children in the units, and you can't tell how many people are going to live in the units. So you need to plan to have a median area so that there is benefits for those people in the units. The other point that I brought up at the ABR was the fact that they should understand and recognize where the shadows of the existing buildings will affect the residential units that are being built. If you are built like this and the sun can't get through, it's not a very pleasant situation. I am particularly concerned, and as the officers of Allied Improvement Association are also concerned about level number D. I note that D has a mandatory shall in the granting of preliminary approval. That is required. It's not a may, it's not a golly gee wow, boys maybe if it's good. It's a shall. And then it goes on to note the phase substantial conformance, which is an extremely vague decision-making statement. What is substantially conformance to me, that's the last page of your document, is not to somebody else. Then I'd like to make a statement of the Landmarks Committee and the ABR members are selected because of their special concern for and their expertise in matters of aesthetics and tradition. Vitally important issues to the city and to the future development of our city will be their prelude. They should be equal partners with the Planning Commission and in the decision-making process. These boards designated by our city charter, in the case of the ABR, are important to the check and balance of government and ultimately to the check and balance in the city council, because you will get appeal after appeal after appeal. Citizens' participation remains an important segment in the decision-making process in our city. Finally, the proposal is disturbing with so many decisions facing the city today and with the generation of a new general plan and the limited resources that we have in our city. I question this decision, this level D, and the way it's being done. I would hope that you would change level D and make it a more equal partnership. You're setting up a potential game. I have a project. I go to the ABR or I go to the Landmarks. They hate it. I say, thank you very much. And then I go up to the Planning Commission and I weasel and waddle and cry and plead, and they give me something, and the ABR hates it. If you want to have cooperation, then set up a system where a couple of ABR members and a couple of planning commissioners meet and work together to get the situation solved. But to give the Planning Commission ultimate power that you will approve this, you shall approve it, is not in the best interest of the city of Santa Barbara, and I thank you.
Mr. DeForest?
Excuse me. Good afternoon. Mike, and I'll echo what the speaker before me said. My concern is, how does the public learn about the impact of a project? It has been my experience that after projects get through the review bodies due to slick presentations, it is only after preliminary approval that the neighbors and citizens realize the impact of this project. It is only then that they voice their objections. We need these autonomous bodies to be able to deny projects that the public objects to. Way back in the 70s, when a developer's plans for the multi-story apartment complex where Alice Keck Park now is, was approved by all bodies. It was only through public outcry and the late Pearl Chase that this project was finally denied. Thank you.
Mr. Berry? Mr. Berry will also be followed by Bill Lavoie from the HLC.
Good afternoon. My name is Gil Berry. I'm a local practicing architect in Santa Barbara. And as a professional architect, I can tell you that the most basic part of design is the height, mass, bulk, and scale and compatibility. And the minor part of design is designing like doors, windows, and little details and things like that. So to take away from design review the essence of design is totally inappropriate. And the city charter has a provision that requires that the ABR review projects for the design and aesthetics. And therefore, the city council cannot, even if you wanted to, put into place this system that has the planning commission or staff hearing officer take away these aesthetic design decisions, which has to do with height, mass, bulk, and scale, from the ABR that is required by our city charter. Now, if you don't want to have two bodies do it, you can have the ABR do the design approval for mass, bulk, and scale, height, and compatibility. But to do it with the planning commission, it violates the city charter. Now, lastly, I think it was appropriate, I think it would be appropriate to have both ABR, HLC, and the planning commission make these findings. And if you have a good project, then both bodies are going to like it and approve it. And in the event that one or the other can't make the finding, is an indication that there's a serious problem with this project that needs to be resolved. And the way that to resolve it is not between the two bodies or the two boards, but to have the applicant work with the board that doesn't approve it, to work with that board to get the design modified so that it does approve it. So that say, like, for example, if the planning commission likes it and the ABR doesn't, that the applicant works with the ABR to modify his project until the ABR likes it. So the idea is, by making the staff change, you're doing nothing but helping a developer with a project that has major problems get through. And by leaving the system the way we have it, where you'd have the finding made by both ABR and the planning commission, it's a process that the developer goes through both hoops, and you have both review bodies make these findings, and that would be able to catch these problems and have them worked out. Thank you.
Mr. Lavoie, but first, I think there's still substantial confusion as to what we're talking about here today, and I'd really appreciate staff and the city attorney to clarify this, because if folks are asking for ABR and HLC to have more discretionary authority than they do now, it's not within the scope of what we're talking about today, though we could be asking for more. I would just submit that there's not an ABR or HLC in the state that has discretionary approval over the meat of a project. So that would be a substantial difference than what we have now. If that's something that we want to ask and discuss about in the future, I think the question at hand is whether or not we're taking away some discretionary power that the ABR or HLC already has. And so can you clarify that?
I'll try. The situation is that both the ABR and HLC and then the Planning Commission have responsibility for these types of important things. It's not that it belongs with just one group and not the other. You can't, I totally agree with Mr. Berry. These are central design issues. Where on the lot the building is placed. How big is the building? That is defining of the design of the project. And so what we're trying to clarify here is that in some instances, the ABR or HLC is the sole discretionary body on a project. And they don't have to agree or disagree with another body. They consider all of these things and approve or deny the project as proposed. Now, I think perhaps as a planner, I explain this differently than the city attorney. I think when you deny the project as proposed, you're not denying the ability of the property owner to ever once again propose a new home on their site or a new mixed-use building, but you're denying it as proposed in toto. You know, the ABR or HLC denies the whole package when they are the only ones seeing it. What this process is about is the bigger projects that have caused concern in this community are being reviewed by both bodies. And when you look at the way the process lays out, it does not make sense to have someone go to HLC and get positive comments or maybe mixed comments, and then go to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission makes substantial findings on the part of the city, then to return to the HLC and have them contradict findings that really, although they have important weight in design, they have already been made by the land use body. So this is the crux of the problem here. Now, are we taking anything away from the ABR or HLC or ultimately the council? I think you have seen cases where the project as approved, if the ABR denies the design and it goes to the plan, let's say the ABR approves the design, it comes to the council on appeal, and it's a planning commission approved project. What does the council usually do? They figure out, just as members of Mr. Berry was saying, figure out how to make the design work. So if you really think about what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how to make the input that these bodies give in the beginning have as much weight and importance as it possibly can. And we don't want to constrain the review boards. If this list isn't big enough, let's make it bigger about what they want to communicate before the decision gets made. That's a very important part of the process. But once the decision gets made, we are saying that their discretion is limited. And I don't think that's new. If you really play this out, project after project, I am aware of one case where what the Planning Commission approved was drawings this big. And so you know what happened when it went to the ABR or the HLC? Actually, at this time it was both because they met jointly. The project was actually this big, what we found out in design review. So design review denied it. And that had the effect of actually denying the whole project because the applicant could not build what the Planning Commission had approved. And this was the Railroad Depot project, and I think some people here remember. And that was one of the times 20 years ago where this conflict, or how did these two very important parts of the city's overall review process work? And if it's that bad, if the Planning Commission approves something that can't be built, well then, and it's confirmed in design review, then they carried the day, you know, and that, this does not preclude that from happening. If the design is not appropriate, then the design review board would deny the project.
Mr. Chair, I got to weigh in here. Betty and I are probably saying the same thing, but it doesn't sound like it. There's an obligation of the design review board to explain what's wrong with the design. They can't just say denied. That's not what their role is. They have to say denied because, and they should be as specific as possible.
Because their discretionary power is over a limited scope on the project. Right.
They've got to give that direction. And so I hear Betty saying things that sounds like you can deny a project, and I think it's a mistake to have that implication. Railroad Depot, Railroad Hotel was probably an out-and-out fraud put over on the Planning Commission 20 or 18 years ago in the pictures that were submitted to them. So that has nothing to do with anything. But
well, it's hopefully it doesn't repeat itself, but it demonstrates that there's checks and balances between the two.
Right. I just think it's really important for design review board members to understand that if they issue a denial, then they have to explain themselves, and hopefully in as much detail as possible, so that an applicant can say, well, then I can always come back years later. No, I'll come back in a few months with my architect responding to your design concerns. Can those design concerns relate to size, bulk, and scale? Certainly. But just an example of what I don't think ABR should be doing is denied because it's got a fourth story. That's a land use determination. In assuming 4 stories are allowed in that zone, and the Planning Commission's approved a 4-story project, to simply say denied because you have a 4th story is not the role of the ABR or the HLC.
And that brings us to one of the things I really will solicit, because I haven't heard any comments on it thus far with the previous speakers. Please, one of the questions we have to ask today is what projects should we be subjecting this criteria to, and what projects should we not? If we subject all projects to the criteria, will substantially increase the workload of staff and the board members. Of course, we want to meet the goals of this process. So it would really be helpful for our committee if people did weigh in on what projects should receive this review and what should not. Mr. Lavoie, followed by Louise Boucher.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm glad you're confused. When I read this first, my eyes crossed, and then I got a headache, and then when I got to page 4, I started screaming, and that's not why I'm hoarse. I have a cold. I apologize. And then I realized once I calmed down that an awful lot of this discussion is about semantics. How this started was we had asked for a communications device so that we could communicate our concerns to the Planning Commission in a very clear, concise way. Because we had felt in the past we have not, until fairly recently actually, given very clear instructions as to why we didn't like or did like a particular project. And we felt that because we hadn't, projects had gotten through that we were stuck with afterwards. And that's really what this is all about. I don't really care what Mr. Wiley wants to call them. I just want an outline that I can go down as chair and go, we've covered this, have we covered this, have we covered this? Commissioners, what do you think about this? And then the other piece of this that we have started doing and been more concerned about are the good features of a project. Because we find that sometimes in the discussion, by the time they come back to us, everything we liked about a project has been wiped off the table for some other concern that the Planning Commission had. And because we didn't mention we liked it, they didn't hear it. Other than if they had read the full or listened to the tape of the minutes, they wouldn't have gotten that information. I take for an example our favorite whipping horse, the Chapala Lofts project. When we first saw that, it had setbacks on the sidewalk of 4 to 6 feet with some substantial landscaping in it. It had a very nice plaza on the corner of Delagara Street that was the main entrance into the project. We liked it when it was 3 stories and when it had all these amenities. When it came back to us from the Planning Commission, all of that was gone. The building was totally pushed to save the creek right against. So instead of taking anything away from the building, the developer pushed it to the street, pushed it in the air. And we were told at that point, this is what the Planning Commission approved, make it pretty. There's no way to make a behemoth like that pretty. We can put all the Spanish frosting on it, all the most gorgeous detailing. It's still going to be a behemoth. That's our problem. That's what we're trying to solve, is that the comments go forward and very clearly. You're about to see a project that's going to the Planning Committee, or you're not going to see it. You probably will. Council will probably see it before it's dead. A project going to the Planning Commission with almost complete negative comments from HLC. There's nothing we liked about it except the underground parking. So when I get to page 4 and read, the HLC would be required to grant preliminary approval of the project if the plans are in substantial conformance with the plans approved by PCSHO. Okay, what if we didn't like this project? Those are the comments we forwarded. We were very clear about it. We almost used the format of the findings to send our forward because we didn't like it so much we wanted to be clear. Okay, they're going to Planning Commission anyway with negative comments. And what if the Planning Commission likes it and it's back to us? We have to approve a project we had no love for in the beginning. You know, size, bulk, and scale, while I agree with Mr. Berry, are extremely important as to how a building reads. It's not the only thing. And that's not the only thing we approve it on. So I have the difficulty with being required. I sympathize with an applicant not wanting to get caught in a crossfire. But I think being very clear to the applicant about what's good, what's bad, is a way of helping the applicant through the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Lavoie. Question? Though I will remind everyone that we've got another half an hour for the hearing.
No, I don't want to speak about that particular project. I want to speak about the concept of a project being able to leave HLC with almost negative comments, all negative comments. How can a project go away from HLC with the majority of the group not liking it? I mean, doesn't it have to be am I mistaken in process? You wouldn't send it to us if you didn't support the project. Am I mistaken?
Well, it's an indefinite continuance to the applicant told us that we want to go to Planning Commission next. We don't really care what you think.
All right. Then I'll have a question for Mr. Wiley. Thank you very much. Mr. Wiley, are we obligated to move a project forward past HLC or ABR if they can't support it? To move it past that to Planning Commission, is there an obligation to move it on?
No, I think that's one of the things that we're talking about here is how would this process work? So I don't think that scenario is going to come up. What the scenario that's drafted, this number 4 that people are concerned about, is HLC or ABR has conceptually approved the project with positive comments. And therefore, at the end, and this happens because of transitions and new ABR or HLC members, at the end, you have an expectation of getting at final approval because you're still consistent with the original one. That's the substantially conforms standard.
Okay, well, you've answered the
But I'd
main
like to
question.
clarify that.
Yes.
An applicant is required to go and have comments from the ABR or HLC as an application submittal requirement. But we can't reject an application if the comments are negative. Okay, so this is where I think an applicant is using the process. If they have a divided commission at HLC or ABR or even a unanimous group that doesn't support something, they can still submit their application for a subdivision, and that is not a basis for us as staff to reject their application. They can submit. What happens then at the Planning Commission meeting is the Planning Commission inclined to approve a project where there is lack of support on the part of the Design Review Board? Is that lack of support so clearly articulated as to why that actually we have inconsistencies with our general plan or an environmental policy inconsistency or impact? So if it's that bad, it will have ramifications down the road, but they can say, as they did apparently here, I'm going to apply. I mean, we can't prevent them from applying, but certainly the Planning Commission is not obligated to approve a project if, from a design standpoint, their advisors, in effect, are saying this is all wrong. They can use that negative feedback as a reason to deny the project.
And I just want to make sure I really understand this, because I've actually been in the process, this whole thing, for a number of years and never understood that. I actually thought that ABR HLC could stop a project with their negative comments, if you will, by saying this, stop it at that point and say we will not send this to PC. So I guess that's not possible. They can't do that. It actually has to.
To my understanding, that is not possible.
The practical matter, what we're talking about here is if they do not receive a conceptual approval from HLC, there's no substantial conformance standard. And at the end of the day, they still have to get preliminary approval. And if HLC says, we didn't like this project in the first place, and we still don't like it, and here are our design concerns, and until you address these concerns, you will not get preliminary approval, there's no problem.
Okay, when the public speakers are done talking, maybe you can help us understand how this D item would not take that opportunity away from an HLC or an ABR if they were in such a situation.
What I would just like to see is, do we have this shell elsewhere already in code? Because if we do already, then it's, then. Okay.
Mr. Chair? Excuse me. I've waited till then, but I'm hoping to frame this a little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Vincent.
Because the Section D was written, and this whole proposal was written in response to and thinking of the current process, which has design review commenting first. Almost unanimously, projects come to the Planning Commission with positive comments from design review. The project that Ms. Weiss is speaking of, in my almost 5 years of working with the Planning Commission, is a single example of a project that has come with generally negative comments to the Planning Commission from design review. In that realm of this process as it exists now, and the comity, the discretion or the respect that the Planning Commission has given to design review in creating its findings and making its findings of the positive design aspects, this is the process. It's incorporated into it. The roles, the role making, and so forth. The reason why I have interjected this is I want to. There's flexibility in the proposal of D. The D isn't expected, or it was not intended to create some kind of dividing line between one body or the other. The two bodies work in concert with one another, but it was intended to be a reflection of how the process has worked to date, and using the tools that we have to date, that positive comments come out of design review are incorporated into Planning Commission decisions, which then return for final design review. The idea behind subsection D was to create a continuity within that process. The should, whether it's a should, shall, so forth, is an open question, but the intent there is to create a continuity through the process.
Okay, so in desperation, I'm going to have to put 2 minutes for public comment and 5 minutes for council comment to make it through this hearing, folks. So let's go.
Chairman, could I ask one quick question?
Sure. Mr. Francis.
Mr. Wiley, I guess the problem I'm having here, the way you explained that, this is to maintain consistency with what, in the typical case, let's say ABR approved with positive comments, goes through the Planning Commission for the land use issues in particular, and then comes back for preliminary approval of ABR. But the language here talks about substantial conformance with what the Planning Commission said.
But I think the answer is that the process in B and C provides for the HLC or ABR comments. And again, we're writing this, and then part of this back and forth is to decide how to do it. We can make it real clear that you don't move on further unless you get a conceptual approval.
I would suggest, because I was going to try to put this out in a second just so I'll wow you all, but maybe we should just get rid of shall, but not change it to may, because may can be interpreted the exact opposite way. I would maybe just ask staff to comment on if we changed it to, we X'd shall and we just said grants preliminary approval. That way we don't use the loaded terms either shall or may, both of which have, exactly, it would change nothing, which is exactly what we need to do.
Mr. Williams?
Right.
Mr. Williams?
Well, Yes.
I think the solution could be to expand that element to explain that not only would it be granted based on its consistency or substantial conformance with what was approved at PC, but also consistency with the ABR HLC comments, a concept review.
So just by adding in that, we would accomplish
that there's an expectation that the applicant would follow the direction of those boards, and that would give them a basis to deny that preliminary approval if they could indicate that it's not consistent with their direction.
Maybe members of the public can comment on that. Louise Boucher, followed by Don Sharp.
Well, this is really an interesting meeting. The one thing I would point out is that the Planning Commission is a land use decision body. And we at HLC believe very firmly in following the urban design guidelines, which were passed by the City Council. And I'm not sure that the Planning Commission follows those. I would hope they would. But from what I've seen, I'm not sure. I do think the one thing to come out of this is that we have to be a lot more positive or negative with our original comments before it goes to Planning Commission. I think we maybe haven't been as clear on that as we have been. I know there's one thing that I will always vote no on, but it's not an out-and-out denial of the group, but I mean of the whole project. But anyway, I think if we can work out that should, however that is, I think Mr. Lamone had a good suggestion there. Thanks.
I'll be very brief. Thank you. I don't want all of this to be an overreaction to the rapid development on Chapala Street and the negative comments and feelings of the public. It's an easy thing to have happen. That's all behind us. And to try and change things that aren't broken, I think, would be a mistake. Basically, I think that the PC, ABR, HLC need better communication. Bill Lavoie and I just realized in the Haywards project that we both came to the Planning Commission, and we realized that it takes 2 or 3 members to be at that meeting in order to really understand what they're saying and thinking. Stella, our liaison to the Planning Commission, HLC's liaison, has been attending every meeting, taking copious notes, and providing the Planning Commission with our feelings, even though our actions may not be crystal clear. Those are the important things. That relationship can be worked out. It just takes more effort and time on behalf of both bodies members, and that would be solved. The project that Mr. Lavoie was talking about, we gave it mega negative comments. We said, you want a 2-week continuance, a 4-week? Oh, no, I'm going right to the Planning Commission. He feels he can get his way there and come back and say, where's my building permit to us? So that is a constant problem. But I think that, by and large, better communication would solve the problem and certainly make it much easier for staff. And I really appreciate this afternoon's conversation. It's long overdue.
Stella Larson, followed by Kathy McCammon.
Oh, thanks. I'm Stella Larson from the Planning Commission, although I was just coming as Stella Larson today, who's done a lot of time at ABR because that's where I came to Planning Commission from, and sign committee and whatever else I got privileged enough to serve as or in. You know, it's not a conundrum to me. It's a matter of clear, crisp communication. It's not a circular discussion even. I find it amazing that something can come to PC with full negative comments and then us be expected to just say, oh, great, 55 condos. Now, let's have PC can the sardines. How are we going to do that? You know, we're not a design review board. There are certain things that we have that trigger red flags, lots of lack of setback, requests for modifications. We look at the plan. We look with a different set of of glasses. We're looking for connectivity. We're looking for openness. We're looking for, and we have to plan for X, Y, Z amounts of units. So it's a difficult thing. But when it comes with lacking findings of mass, bulk, and scale, height, and those sorts of things, then that is the biggest red flag of all. Because we have to make findings of sound community planning. We have to use the charter. We have to use the Subdivision Act. We have to say that things aren't detrimental to health and safety and traffic and all these other things. But we're not able to do that in a cogent way if it doesn't come with some kind of comments that we can use ourselves to evaluate the project. And architecture is a very important part of that. So I don't want to neglect that. And in terms of D on the ordinance, which I was wishing would be up there, I think the word shall is rough, because when something comes as concept, I mean, it can come as a bubble diagram to us. And it's loose talk. It's paper talk. It's cartooning, we call it. It's everything. It's talking on paper. That's what it is. We can't say, unless it's really slam it home, that at a concept level it's ready for preliminary. No way. We can make comments, and it should go back from whence it came for real work and substantive attention to what we've made comment, like connectivity or whatever it is, parking underground, whatever. But it goes back to the architectural review. So to take a bubble diagram from concept to saying it shall have a preliminary approval is really asking for an awful lot from them and really a lot from us. So I'm just saying that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I love that we can communicate more. I'm working very hard to increase communication between PC and HLC, and part of what I request occasionally is please send out the media that supports that meeting so that everybody can have a look at this item before it gets to us. So I've asked for better findings, or not even findings, better comments, stronger comments, and we're getting them. It's good. So I don't see how we shall go from concept at any meeting to preliminary approval at another. I just think it's asking too much. So thank you very much, and I'll spare you the other little list. Thanks.
Kathy McCammon, followed by Tony Fisher.
Yes, I'm Kathy McCammon from the League of Women Voters, and we attended the July 18th workshop, and we also had addressed the need for more appropriate findings for large, tall buildings. We agreed the design review bodies needed tougher standards and tools to deal with these proposed projects. Thank you. We totally agree with the statement on page 2 of your staff report. The intent of the proposed findings was to reaffirm the ABR and HLC's role in evaluating projects' proposed height and compatibility with existing development at the concept review, and to serve as a checklist of necessary issues that the design review board would need to consider and comment on prior to the project proceeding to the Planning Commission or staff hearing officer. The findings would be made at the preliminary approval level. We thought this was an important milestone and tool. It would make the determination of compatibility early in the process where it belongs at the HLC or ABR. This would be early in the process and provide a developer with the clear direction that the size, bulk, and scale of a project may be too big and would need to be fixed. Compatibility findings should always be made at the HLC and ABR, and the PC and the staff hearing officer's land use decisions must conform to the limitations put on it by ABR and HLC. Compatibility is in large part an aesthetic rather than a land use decision. Aesthetic determinations are a key component of the role of the ABR and HLC. To just allow them to make comments isn't adequate and would undermine their role. This totally sends the wrong message to a developer. He or she needs to know with certainty at the earliest possible stage that it may be necessary for them to make changes to their project sooner rather than later. Therefore, we strongly oppose staff's latest proposal and urge you to do likewise and reject the notion that substantive approval would be made at the Planning Commission or the staff hearing officer on a project site and height. Please keep this determination at the ABR and HLC where it belongs early in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher, followed by Mark Weinke.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Fisher, and I came to listen and decided to speak. Better communication is always a solution to a lot of problems. Realize that when HLC or ABR make comments, they may do it at more than one meeting, and then those comments go to Planning Commission, and nobody knows at that meeting whether those comments were devoted to the plan in front of them or an earlier version. So the communication gets messed. It may look like we liked size, bulk, and scale, or it may look like we liked something or we didn't like something, but it doesn't necessarily get communicated as to exactly what they were looking at. So there's a lot of gaps in the process how mistakes and misunderstandings can happen. But I think in terms of this paragraph D, when you're looking at HLC and ABR, you have to maintain the integrity within each of those boards. To say we like a project at the beginning, to send it off to somebody else who can make changes to it, and then say you shall like it when it comes back, destroys the integrity of the ABR because it is now being required to like something that it maybe doesn't like. The charter, as I recall, and I'm just surprised it's not up on the walls, the charter provisions, the charter says that no building permit shall be issued without approval of the ABR. Doesn't say as approved by Planning Commission or anything else. It says no building permit without approval of the ABR. And I think that was intentional. And I'm reminded that when I first came to Santa Barbara and got involved with reading about these conflicting boards and commissions that were making Santa Barbara historic, I was told, don't mess with that process. It may not be perfect, but it works, and it continues to work. But we don't tell the HLC to step aside and approve what somebody else likes. We don't tell the ABR to do that. We let each project go to those bodies. If it can't get a favorable vote or it gets too many conditions, it goes up to City Council. And then you hear from all of your experts and you make the ultimate decision. But this concept that we're going to intercept and maybe let a mistake, and I could stand here and talk about 3 or 4 projects that are currently in the process.
I'd appreciate it if you didn't,
okay,
because you're a minute over.
Thank you.
Mr. Weineke?
Thank you. Mark Winke, ABR Chair. Lots of good things being said here. I'm going to be really short. I think if in this process we talked with Jaime about these 6 individual things here. We discussed them back and forth. I think we'd use them in this way, so if this makes any decision easier for you or harder. We look at each one of these things probably, and all the 8 or 9 people on the board at any given time, some people would say, I fully believe in number 2, but I don't believe in number 4. If we have to make complete findings on all of them, it may be a series of averages. For example, we may say, okay, number 1, compliance, who all agrees with this? It's a short, quick straw vote. When you get down to number 5, it may be a 4-3, right? Number 1 may be 8-0. But I think in that sense, as it gets to the next level, which would be the Planning Commission, they would say, well, you know, the first 4, they look pretty good. We're not really worried about that. We're worried about number 4. And I kind of agree with the 3 that were not in compliant with the public view part, right? If we just state that here are the 6 and we have a vote that says 4-3, the board was in favor of this project based on these stipulations, these guidelines, you would never know any of those things, would you? So I think these are good. There could be even more. They could be split up different ways. But I think if we separate them into ways that we like about it, and then actually to add to the final part, things like Bill Lavoie mentioned, and these are the reasons we really like the project. One, we like the muse going through the project. Two, we like the fact that there's 2 stories next to 3 stories next to 2 stories. We like the fact there's public open space that's no smaller than 1 acre, blah, blah, blah. So we could list those things that get on as part of a motion. Of course, all that takes a lot of time. And if you've been to an ABR meeting, we see the project usually for the first time. We're sometimes scheduled only for even big projects 1 hour to review these things, and then without being, at the end of a working day, try to be very coherent in how you're listing these are very difficult at best. And we really appreciate Gloria making sense out of our nonsense sometimes. But if we had a list at this type of thing, we probably would just state 4-3 vote agreed with this, 5-3 on that, 8-0, 8-0, 8-0. So I think it would be a good thing. And we did yesterday see a project that was passed by the staff hearing officer, and we did turn it back. Didn't say go back to staff hearing officer. We just said we think it's way too big still. Make it smaller, get rid of this, do that, do that. So it's not, when it comes back to us, it's not carte blanche that they're going in with a stamp on that. So, thank you.
Thank you. Does staff have any comments before we go to the committee members? Hearing none. Committee members? I would remind committee members that we have 4 questions in addition to the basic question of the language before us. But the 4 questions are: what types of projects require these considerations? Should some projects be exempt from this type of review consideration? 3, should the consideration review criteria be expanded or reduced? And 4, is the question format appropriate, or are there other suggestions from the committee? Mr. Francisco?
Chair Williams,
Sure.
I'm sorry for the interruption. You asked people to comment on your first question, which is which projects this should apply to, and I didn't hear anyone say anything.
I didn't hear anything either.
I just want to offer my opinion. I think it should apply to whichever project they think it should apply to. I mean, I really just want to put that out there as a concept, that trying to, the way this process works, why constrain this group if the point is, or these groups, is to improve their ability to communicate?
Right.
So no one else commented on that. I wanted to say maybe that's a good thing. We shouldn't decide that.
Okay. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I agree with that last suggestion. I think that's an excellent one. This whole process started out over 6 months ago as a response to public concern. And I think staff did a great job of putting together this idea of the checklist and talking over with the ABR and with HLC the concept of the checklist and trying to tune that. I'm, given that really the only negative comments we've heard here are about paragraph D, or at least the primary negative comments are, I'm wondering if maybe, we're over-designing this a little bit. I think everyone would agree that having this sort of checklist is a step forward. And maybe what we should do is implement that part of it, and maybe that will just improve things. And if it turns out that we need this further step of clarification, which, at least from what I can tell in this room, has been very difficult to clarify, then we tackle that. But I think, the work that you've done so far with the checklist idea, I think, is a great response to the public concern. And why don't we implement what seems relatively straightforward to implement and learn from it?
Mr. House?
I was also reading communication from Steve House, and he had kind of come to a similar conclusion in the idea that he had the 5, he didn't have the 6 with the view thing in there, but his idea was that the idea of a checklist made sense, but I like Mr. Lavoie's comments. It helped me really understand the value of what we're doing, and that is to enhance the communication between the discretionary review bodies, and to make certain that when something goes to the Planning Commission, or even later when it comes on appeal, that the rationale for the decision, and also the highlights, particularly sore points or points of some things that really should continue to be part of that project are communicated well. I mean, as a planning commissioner, I recall going back through the minutes of the meetings, and I had to wind the clock back from the ABR conversation, and well, this is where they started, and this is where they ended up, and I had to see watch sort of the progression or the evolution of the project and imagine that process. And but the clearer that ultimate communication, the final communication was to us, the better. And I really see the value of it. I don't know that we need to introduce this D thing at this time, unless there's some way to do it with what Mr. Lamone suggested to just really clarify that. But I don't know if it's that broken that we need to fix it. And I do think the communication piece could really be enhanced by these 6 items. And I like the way, Mark, I like the way that you were suggesting it might be used, or I think that's, yeah, you were, that it wouldn't just be, oh, we checked them all off, but we get some sensitivity to what the issues were, both through the minutes, which are a very important communications tool, and the vote on each of the items. I'm just a little worried about the time it might take to do that, but we give it a try. So those are my comments at this time on this. I'm really looking forward to, I think if I were in Planning Commission, I'd really be happy about having the clarity. One of the other things, I don't think, we've got to be very careful. This doesn't mean that this is the only 6 things that get to be communicated. We didn't just limit the purview. That wasn't the idea, right? Okay, I want to be sure, because there's other stuff. Okay.
Well, one of the things that I also agree with the sentiment to leave out D if that's possible. Perhaps staff could comment on without a consistency review. See, I'm used to coastal law. Not having a consistency review is really bad, but it seems to me that we already have it in place, the relationship articulated in the charter, so we don't necessarily need D to proceed forward.
I tend to agree. This is something about resolving a isolated or a few problems right now that in our time here has not been that common. So it's probably not worth trying to resolve an isolated problem with this right now. The communication's good. If I could comment on one other thing, I think we've used the word checklist as a shorthand way to refer to these things. But we don't really mean, I don't think we really mean that we want the design review boards simply checking boxes or indicating yes or no. We really want substantive comments, as you say, in the minutes. So I just wanted to qualify that use of the word checklist. We're not going to have a yes-no boxes and stuff like that. We're looking for real comments from individual commissioners about projects.
My only additional comments would be that I'm hoping that we can provide more specific versions of a couple of these to frame maybe perhaps some of the discussion in Planning Commission. I think specifically what the body politic is looking for is some kind of policy on larger buildings, 3- and 4-story buildings, and what kind of benefits should they provide to even exist. And I think that that's a legitimate discussion to have. And so my only question from staff would be, how can this committee advise to expand or make more specific some of these criteria for Planning Commission itself?
Mr. Chair, I believe that that's actually a good direction to go with, because I think currently, I would guess that our boards and commissions are very gun shy. They've reacted in a very conservative way, rightly so, because of the concerns that people have expressed on size of scale, height of buildings. Right now, we do have something in our urban design guidelines that speak to exceptions to compatibility to allow higher buildings that in parts of the city where it would be appropriate. It's very narrowly defined as far as the type of exceptions. I think we could focus in on that area and ask our boards and commissions under what circumstance could they allow a higher building, under what type of criteria could that be allowed? And maybe expand on those areas so everyone could understand in some instances where that type of height could be supported.
And so would that come to us, or how are we going to do that?
I just want to clarify what we mean by higher building, because last time, not last time, but I spent some time
Everybody wants to know
with a
what that
reporter about this, that you cannot approve a building over the charter or zoning height limits. So when we're saying, if we look at the urban design guidelines, as a guideline, if a new proposed project is presenting a higher profile, a larger building, a taller building in a neighborhood or an area where there aren't many taller buildings, then it's relative to neighborhood compatibility in the street and the surrounding that a taller building is supportable. People need to understand that you can't approve a taller building than what is the maximum that is set. And where this is used, I think Jaime is correct. It's in the design review process. This could be certainly one of the items that the HLC or ABR highlight in their communication to the Planning Commission, if that's what they're doing, or in their own deliberation on a project. If they should be aware that discretion on whether or not the height of the building is appropriate is within the design review discretion, but you cannot exceed an allowable height.
I guess my question would, where could the committee or council or the design review bodies submit ideas for substantiating that? Meaning, number 5, I would say that you would spell out to the Planning Commission, we don't want you to approve a 4-story building unless a certain amount of the massing of the views is protected, for instance, or higher than current code inclusionary requirement or other things like that.
I think what we could do, if this committee is inclined to move this to council, is that we could, in the next report, include excerpts from the design guidelines that you're referencing and have a little bit more discussion in that council report, because I think it may be, again, a bigger, broader policy discussion, and if the council wants to take that opportunity to discuss it, I think you should, as the council, on how you would interpret that guidance as it stands today, and what you would like us to explore further if we need to develop additional policies or standards.
Mr. House?
Well, I think that's probably the right approach, and that it can be included as part of the report that we brought this up, and it's something to see if council would like to give it back to staff and to us to chew on. I think there may be some value in doing that. For the more limited scope of the purpose of today's conversation, there's just 2 things I'd like to say. One, it sounds like it would be of value for the Planning Commission, and maybe in a group setting with HLC, ABR, to review the urban design guidelines, EPV guidelines, and just kind of get all that back up on the table and refresh everybody's memory. It could be helpful, so everybody's speaking the same language. But secondly, I want to recommend that we forward these 6 questions on to the City Council for introduction and adoption as a process to use, and that could. Perhaps staff has another way, but I want to make sure that we do move forward from this with some sense of having accomplished something in our conversation. I believe that the section D in our minutes that will omit that from our recommendation at this time.
Mr. Chair, I think what we had planned, and maybe the motion can be towards this, is that we would come back with an ordinance incorporating these into basically Title 22, and I think to some extent in the zoning ordinance for ABR, and, well, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about the need but at least the ABR and HLC chapters would be amended. So we'd come back with a draft to do that. I think we've received the direction we're looking for.
Well, a question I had earlier, a week or so ago, was whether or not we had to come back with an actual draft ordinance here.
That's the way it's normally done. I mean, the ordinance,
just because, again, in an interest of the ABR used this tool yesterday. We want to use it next week. So I don't think that we necessarily need to wait until there's an ordinance, and that I don't know how complicated the ordinance would be, whether or not this group could move it on to council, or if you would like to see the ordinance without paragraph D, that's probably what it would look like, something like the rest of what you saw.
I do think they have pretty well spelled out what would be the meat of the ordinance.
May I make I have a question. Is this actually something that requires an ordinance, or is this a procedural thing, since we're not identifying them as findings in that formal sense?
I think it should be an ordinance, because it's going to get lost if it isn't.
Okay, then do you need an action from us today, or do we just, do you just take the sense of our committee's conversation and then come back to us?
My understanding is, with the city attorney opinion, that it should be an ordinance to give it greater weight. I certainly support that. And whether or not this body has to have reviewed an actual draft ordinance or not, I asked that question, and you don't have to.
You don't always do that, but normally you do.
Yeah. So you could, it's up to you, either move it forward to council or ask us to return. Either one is an appropriate action, is completely fine.
Your preference, Mr. Francisco? To me, I want to see this go to council as quickly as possible and start addressing the problem. If we feel like we have spelled that out today, I'm fine with moving it forward to council without review here. But
I was going to say that I'm sorry. I was going to say that if we can do this in a lightweight way, more along the lines of what Ms. Weiss was suggesting, I think that's better. Get the ABR and the HLC seem receptive to the basic idea here, and if they use these questions and we get some experience with it, we're not stopping anything. I think everyone agrees this is a good idea. Why not go forward with that and get some experience, have staff come back to us with that experience and an ordinance before we recommend it to council, so the council doesn't have to spend time guessing about it. That would be my recommendation.
Okay, I'm going to revise my motion to have staff bring back a bring back a draft ordinance to ordinance committee for us to recommend to city council.
I'll second, but what about lucky number 7 on this list, which is the what public benefits are provided by this project? I would say that we would want to still add that element. I thought that we talked about that in discussion, and I would submit that we would say what public benefits are provided by this project, what, if any, are so important that one of the previous criteria is not met, as 2 separate questions on a number 7.
Mr. Chair, I was going to avoid weighing in on this. That's a huge issue, and I could talk for about 15 minutes about what the legal concerns
Please
are
don't.
there. So I just want to forewarn that that's a huge issue. This entire discussion has been about the internal merits of a project as opposed to the external merits of transfer of development rights is so good that we're going to allow you to have 4th stories. We haven't even been talking about that. And
well, I think some people did want a format for communicating what the part of the projects that they liked and wanted Planning Commission to keep in the project today. Why would that be a pitfall just for the design review body to mention what they particularly like about the project?
I have to tell you a lot about takings law and what's changed in the last 25 years and how it's one thing to say that the internal merits of a project are acceptable or not acceptable, but the external merits, the community benefit, the $10 million contribution to the general fund is okay, so you can have 4 stories, is just an entirely different discussion legally.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. My goal here was to focus on the ones that we had on our agenda today, but not to foreclose that as a possibility. I would hope that maybe staff would just mention to the City Council, I certainly will bring it up, that we broach the topic and see if they would want us to go and do some more investigation, at which time Mr. Wiley would have sufficient time to explain to us all the ins and outs, and then we maybe could move in that direction or not. But that would be, I think, at a separate time.
I would just ask that we include in that the requirement that staff articulate for us a manner, or if there is no manner, in which public benefits can be articulated through that process for that staff report to council.
It's just not easy, and
okay.
To me, it brings up the Santa Barbara general plan update, but it's a huge undertaking to have to justify exactions, and that's essentially what we're talking about here.
Mr. Chair, could we ask them for a short briefing on that topic at the ordinance committee meeting when we get our ordinance in front of us, so that we would get the ordinance to approve out of our conversation today, but perhaps we would allow a little bit of time for the staff to brief us on this exact topic, so we could have a little bit of a heads up as to what that might entail.
But we're just deciding to send it on without coming back to ordinance
Just the 6, again, just focusing on these 6 and not closing off the possibility of this other conversation, but not taking it up today. Just getting these 6 so that these guys have the chance to communicate well with PC and it's got the firmness of the ordinance.
I'm suggesting that staff present whether a number 7 is possible at the city council hearing in which this is discussed.
We'll be returning to the ordinance committee first, because your motion is to return to you. So when we're back here, we'll be sure to have prepared some background information on this related but separate subject.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. We'll adjourn.